Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and this week we are going to talk about the tzitz, the golden band kind of crown of the kohen gadol that says Kodesh LaHashem on it, sanctified to God or consecrated to God, because in this week's daf on Menachot Kaf Hey, Menachot 25, we talk about the role of the tzitz, the role of that crown in gaining acceptance for korbanot that are, I'm going to say, sacrificed when the substances of the korbanot themselves are tameh, or sacrificed when most of the Jewish people or most of the kohanim are tmeim lamed. So the first thing I want to do is I want to actually think about the world of tum'ah in the Mikdash. At the beginning of our learning of Masechet Shevuot, way back when, I gave a shir about the reasons why kedusha is allergic to tum'ah, the reasons why we are so concerned with the possibility of tum'ah getting into the Mikdash. People should definitely go back and listen to the shir. My basic take on it is that tum'ah represents mortality in a very deep way. The mikdash represents the immortality of God, and those two things don't go together. But the reason why I want to bring this up again is because we've already had, back in Masechet Shevuot, we've already had conversations about the trouble of having tum'ah in relation to kachim. And that trouble was basically what's known as tumat mikdash vekodeshav, somebody who goes into the mikdash when they're tameh, or somebody who eats kachim, who eats consecrated foods from the mikdash when they are tameh. And in that situation, what we saw is that if they do that b'shogeg, if they do that unwittingly, but they knew before that they were tameh, and they knew afterwards that they were tameh. They knew before that it was the mikdash, and they knew afterwards that it was the mikdash. They knew before that this was consecrated food. They knew afterwards that this was consecrated food. They give a korban olav yored. Remember that type of korban chatat, that it's gradational depending on how the means that you have, right? If you have enough means, you give a four-legged animal. If you don't have enough means, you give birds. And if you don't have enough means for that, you give flour. Then there was a whole conversation. This is in the first parak of Shevuot, the Mishnayot. If people want to take a look, really outline this. There were conversations about what if you didn't know beforehand? What if you didn't know afterwards? What if you never knew? And so there are all these different things, including the Seir LaHashem on Yom Kippur, including the Seir LaZazel, the scapegoat on Yom Kippur, including the Seirim that we give on the Shalosh Regalim, including maybe even the Seirim that we give on Roshei Chodashim. All of these things were supposed to make up for the systemic assumption that people were going to walk into the Mikdash Tameh accidentally, and people were going to eat kachim b'tumah accidentally. Now, this is very different from what the Tzitz is doing. The reason why it's very different from what the Tzitz is doing is because that whole conversation is about gaining kapara, gaining atonement for someone for doing those things, walking into the mikdash when they're tameh, eating consecrated food when they're tameh. That was to gain kapara for them, to gain atonement for them. The tzitz is doing something different. First of all, the tzitz is not about walking into the mikdash tameh or eating kachim when you're tameh. The tzitz is actually about giving a korban, where the korban, it's about giving a korban. Let's just start with that. It's actually about giving a korban, and tum'ah is somehow involved, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is the tzitz is not just about, it's not about gaining atonement. It's actually about gaining acceptance of that korban, even though there was tum'ah involved, right? So it's a different track of the conversation. And I just want us to recognize that in this track also, this is a systemic feature, right? I mean, the kohen gadol wears the tzitz all the time, right? Which means there's an assumption tum'ah is going to get in there somehow, right? This is the reality of trying to maintain a place that is sanctified to God, but is inhabited all the time by human beings walking in and out, doing what they're supposed to do, and physical substances, just all physicality that's engaged there. So that's the first thing I just want to make very clear. Now, within the conversation about what the tzitz gains ritzui for, what the tzitz gains acceptance for in terms of korbanot, This is where we start with a basic discussion, not even starting with the Gemara that we have this week, a more basic discussion of whose tum'ah? A tum'ah of the person giving the korban, or the tum'ah of the korban itself, or some aspects of the korban itself. So that's where I want to start. I actually want to start with a Mishnah in Psachim that is very basic on this and very foundational on this question. Okay? It goes like this. And we will get back to the psukim that describe the tzitz a little bit later. The Mishnah in Psachim, Perek Zayin, Mishnah Zayin, says as follows. HaPesach shenizrak damo, a korban pesach that has already had the blood sprinkled, okay? Ve'achar kach noda shehu tameh. And afterwards, it was found that the korban itself was tameh, okay? Hatzitz miratzeh. The tzitz gains acceptance of that korban, meaning I gave my korban pesach. I found out afterwards that the blood of the pesach, whatever it was, I found out afterwards that something of that pesach was tameh. It's still a fine korban. I don't have to bring another korban pesach, okay? What about if instead of saying that the korban was tameh, what if I was tameh, right? Now, I want to make very clear. I'm not saying everybody's tameh. I'm not saying most people are tameh. I'm saying just I was tameh, right? And we're talking about, well, let's just pause. I was tameh. Nitma haguf. If it was the goof, meaning the goof of the person, the body of the person, and we're talking about either the kohen, to be honest, or the person who's giving, ein hatzitz miratzeh. The tzitz does not gain acceptance for that, okay? So the first thing we need to know is it's assumed in this Mishnah that it's the tum'ah of the korban that the tzitz will get the korban accepted, and it's not the tum'ah of the person, okay? It's not the tum'ah of the person. So that's another way that this is different from the other track that's trying to gain kapar. It's not the tum'ah of the person. That korban, if the person is tameh, the kohen, or the ba'alata korban, the person whose korban it is, it's not accepted. Okay? You have to do another one. Now, there is an exception to that rule, and the exception shows up at the end of the Mishnah, which is nitma tum'at hatehom hatzitz miratzeh. If a person became tameh as a result of what we call the tum'ah of the abyss, meaning this refers to tum'ah that was unknown to anyone, could not have been known to anyone, okay? That kind of tum'ah, even on the tum'ah taguf, the person, the tzitz is miratzeh, right? The tzitz gains acceptance for that korban. I find out afterwards, I was tme'ah with tum'ah tehom, the tzitz worked, okay? It's actually an accepted korban. Now, for those who might have noticed, this Mishnah says the Pesach that had its blood already sprinkled, what if we found out it was tameh before the blood was sprinkled? So the Gemara will deal with that and say, you can sprinkle the blood then too, right? In the tzitz, if the korban itself becomes tameh, the tzitz becomes, the tzitz says you can still give that korban, okay? Tumat Guf is a little more complicated. If it's the person or the kohen, no dice. You need another korban. But if it's the person or the kohen, but it was tumat tahom, then you don't need another korban. It works, right? So you see, we're like building layers here. Now to our Gemara in Menachot. Our Gemara in Menachot brings up another issue, which, by the way, sounds like tumat haguf, but it's not quite tumat haguf. I mean, it is, but it's not of an individual, and that is, the Gemara on Kaf Hey Amud Aleph says, Eino noseh ela avon toma shehutra michlala betzibur. What is the tumah that the tzitz is going to help you with and allow the korban to be accepted? Not when the materials themselves become tameh, although on Kaf Hey Amud Bet we will say that, right? not when an individual kohen or owner of the korban is tameh, but actually in the strange case that we call tum'ah hutra b'tzibur. Tum'ah hutra b'tzibur is when you have a korban tzibur to give, and most of the most of the nation is tameh. Think about war. Or most of the kohanim are tameh. We say, and I include in the sources for people who want to look at it, that based on the korban pesach having to be given b'moado in its time, even if b'moado is Shabbat, you give it. Even b'moado, most people are tameh, or most kohanim are tameh, you give it. And then from there, we learn to other korbanot tzibur. So if you have a korban tzibur, where most people have tum'at haguf, right? And we're talking about tum'at made here, right? We're not talking about other kinds of tum'ah. We're talking about the tum'ah of contact with the dead, right? With a human dead body. Then the tzitz also gains you acceptance for that, okay? So just stick with me here for a minute. We're not talking about kapara, we're talking about acceptance of a korban. We have four possible situations. One is it's about the tum'ah of the korban. Another is it's about the tum'ah of the korban is accepted already. We saw it in that Mishnah in Psachim, right? Another is it's about the tum'at haguf of an individual, which we saw in that Mishnah in Psachim. If it's a tum'at tahom, sure, the tzitz is going to gain you ritzui. But if it's tum'ah that any human being would have known about, any human being, right? Not even the human beings in question, but any human being would have known about, the tzitz is not going to gain you acceptance, and you have to give another korban. And then we have tum'ah hutra b'tzibur, which is tumat haguf, but it's of most people, and the korban is allowed, and the tzitz gets you ritzui, right? So like, a lot going on here. Now, I want to say that in our Gemara as well, Rav Ashi does say, avon hakodashim v'lo avon hamakdishim, right? That that the tzitz should be meratzeh. Aaron is carrying, the kohen gadol is carrying the avon of the kodshim, of the sanctified objects themselves, namely the korban, and not the makdishim, not the people who are bringing that korban, right? So that's how you get tumah of the object, but not tumah. But does that mean that it also shouldn't apply to the tumah hutra b'tzibur situation? Or is it just about individuals? And what exactly is going on with this tahom situation? Okay. So I think it's not so simple. What I do want to say is when you look at Tosfot actually want to be very, very clear. And they basically want to say, no, the tzitz is just about the korban getting tameh. It's not about people, whether the people are individuals, whether the people are most of the people in the nation or most of the kohanim, meaning tumah hutra b'tzibur. It's tumat haguf. That's not what the tzitz does. The tzitz is not involved in tumat haguf. Okay, so the Tosfot in Menachot on Ted Vav Amud Aleph say as much. Okay, we say ha ein hatzitz miratze al tumat haguf ki the pirish bekuntras, as Rashi explains, I guess on Ted Vav. The tzitz does not gain acceptance of a korban if there's tumat haguf involved, meaning if there's tumah of the person involved. But vidarish lekaman b'hakometz rabba, we see in our daf this week, Menachot daf kafeh, avon hakadshim. And consequently, we see in our Gemara on Menachot daf kafeh, avon hakadshim hu noseh v'lo avon hamakdishim. Right? Aaron is carrying the tzitz. Essentially, is carrying the sin of the objects themselves being tameh and being given that way, rather than the person who owns the korban or the kohen being tameh. Ubeperak sheni dizvachim, and in the second chapter, zvachim nami amriyan behedya, we say clearly to ein hatzitz miratz al tumat haguf. The tzitz does not gain acceptance of a korban that was given when the kohen was tameh or the individual was tameh. But now Tosfot has to deal with the fact of, but what do you mean? We do say that the tzitz is meratzeh when it comes to tumah hutra b'tzibur, and tumah hutra b'tzibur is tumat haguf. So Tosfot say, "V'hada amar b'perek keitzad solin." The fact that we say in Psachim, Dilemanda Amar Tuma Dechuya, that according to the one who says that when you give a korban betuma, because it's a situation of a korban tzibur and most of the tzibur is tameh, or most of the kohanim are tameim, that's only a situation of tuma dechuya, meaning we don't say it's fully acceptable. We say it's the tuma has been overridden, but still baya tzitz liritzuye. You still need the tzitz in order to gain acceptance of the korban, right? So you say, how could that be? I thought that tzitz doesn't deal with tumat haguf. So Tosfot say, Hainu l'tumat basar demahani. It actually only helps if the basar is tamei. Demahani tzitz. Aval l'tumat haguf. Delo mahani tzitz. Afilu below tzitz. Tzitz has nothing to do with it. Tzitz has nothing to do with it. Tumah b'tzibur is its own thing. Tumah t'chui b'tzibur is its own thing. Now, that's what the Tosfot are trying to make a clear break, right? Now, it actually makes sense to think about it as a clear break because, look, I think the idea of the tzitz, being like a kli of the mikdash and being involved not with people's tumah, but just with the tumah of the korban itself, there is something to that, right? The kli meets substance as opposed to substance meets person, something like that. I'm not sure if that really works, but I'm trying to think it through. Like, why would you say goof is out, tumat haguf is out, but only the tumah of the korban is in? Okay. But I want you to see that the Rambam actually tries to hold it. He tries to have it all, the Rambam. He tries to have it all. He tries to say, okay, it's when the korban meat become tameh, and meat also, I'm including flour and I'm including blood and that style. The korban meat becomes tameh. It's not when a yachid, for a korban yachid, it's not when a kohen is tummy, it's not when the owner is tummy, unless it's tumat tahom, in which case it does work. And it also is for tumah b'tzibur, a situation where most of the tzibur is tameh, or most of the kohanim are tameh, and you have to give a korban tzibur. And anyway, what the tzitz does is it allows it to get accepted. Okay? He wants to have all of it. So let's look at the Rambam, and then I want to look at a Perush on the Rambam that makes a suggestion about what is the Rambam actually trying to say, and that's going to give us a little bit of like a balcony view, slightly. The tzitz, I think, is actually it's complicated. Okay, so the Rambam says kohen she'avad v'achar kach noda shehaya tameh. This is Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, Perek Daled. A kohen who did the worship and then found out that he was ritually impure. Im hi tuma yedua. If it's a known tumah, meaning it's not tumah tahom, meaning somebody in the world knows that there was a dead body buried in such and such a place, right? Kol ha-korbanot she'ikriv psulin, sharei avodato chulin. Any of the korbanot that he did in that state, all puzzle. Tzitz can't help you. V'im hi tumat tahom, hatzitz meratze. But if it was tumat tahom, meaning it was, nobody knew that there was, sadly, a cadaver or parts of a cadaver in the split, right? And he became tameh, the tzitz actually allows all those korbanot to be accepted. V'chol korbanot she'ikrivu nirtzu. All of the korbanot that he's given in that state are accepted. Va'afilu noda lo shehu tameh kodem she'yizrok hadam v'zarak. Even if he knew before he actually did the zrikat hadam, which we know is the essence, right, of the animal korbanot, and then he did the zrikat hadam knowing that he was tameh with tumat tahom, hurtza, it's accepted. She'atzitz meratze al tumat hatahom af al pi shehu mezid. The tzitz can gain acceptance for a korban, even if tumat tahom is involved, even if it's on purpose, meaning when you continue the korban anyway. And we've already explained what tumat tahom is in the laws of the Nazir, because there's a Mishnah in Nazir that also talks about tumat tahom. Okay? V'chein atzitz meratze al tumat dvarim hakrivin. And likewise, the tzitz can gain acceptance of a korban for things that are being offered, meaning the tumah of the korban itself. Shneimar, as it says, Vayal metzach Aaron v'nasa Aaron edavon ha-kodoshim, right? Meaning it's Aaron is carrying the sin of the actual consecrated items themselves. Here, the tumah of the korban materials. Aval eino meratzal tumata ne'echalin. But it can't be, it doesn't help you with the tumah of the stuff that's supposed to be eating. Only the stuff that goes on the mizbeach, right? Which again is sort of like the tzitz as a kli of the mizbeach, as a kli of the mikdash, and the korbanot as part of the mikdash itself, as opposed to the things that are going to be eaten, right? Like anything with humans, maybe. Velo al tumat ha'adam shenitma b'tumah yidua, but not on the tumah of a person if it's a known tumah, meaning it's not tumah tahom. Ela im kein hayta ha'tumah ha'dechuya b'tzibur shatzis meratzela, except when it's a tumah hudra b'tzibur situation, right? Except when it's most people are tameh lamit, or most kohanim are tameh lamit. So he's trying to have all of it, right? He's trying to hold it, and you see why he's trying to hold all of it. He's trying to hold all of it because it's really in the sources, right? Like it's really in the sources. So how do we understand? It's not as clear cut as Balei Tosfot, who just say, you know, like it's only on Tuma of the objects and it's not on Tuma Guf at all, right? Like these are separate situations. Tuma B'tzibur is its own way of dealing with Tuma, and it has nothing to do with the tzitz. Whereas the Rambam is a little more complex. So I want to look at the Eben HaEzel. The Eben HaEzel is Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to see somebody who lived into the 20th century, right? I think he died mid 20th century. And the Eben HaEzel says as follows. Says, Midivrei HaRambam, well, he asks the question on the Rambam, right? He says, Midivrei HaRambam mevuar degam betumatam akrivim hatzitz maratze. It seems like, from the Rambam's perspective, even the ritual impurification of the people giving the korban, the tzitz also allows acceptance of the korban there, right? And then he says, V'hu tema. I'm just skipping to the next line. I don't get it. Dahab is vachim, kaf gimel amid bed, and menachot, kaf hey amid aleph. Don't we say, Amar b'gemer, we say, tumat kodshim, v'lo tumat hamakdishim. It's the tumah of the items, not the tumah of the people giving the items, right? So I don't get it. How is this possible? Skipping to the next paragraph. So he says, well, B'nir b'data Rambam, you know what I think? The Rambam thinks the bedin ritzui tzitz yesh shnei dinim. Maybe there are two levels of how the tzitz works. Echad hu liratzot hakorban shenesa b'tumah. One is to gain acceptance for a korban that was done in ritual impurity, right? V'zehu v'haya al mitzchot tamid liratzon lahem lifnei Hashem. And that's what's meant in the Torah, and we'll go back to the psukim, that's how we're going to end. That's what's meant in the Torah when it says the tzitz is going to be on the forehead of the kohen gadol always as acceptance before God, right? But there's a second track within the tzitz. The second is Mashehu Nose Avon Hatum'ah, Mashe Asur Lahakriv Korban Betum'ah. Says a second track is actually trying to make that which is not permitted to be given as a korban to allow you to do it. V'zehu v'nasa Aharon et Avon HaKodashim. And that is a different clause in the pasuk. And Aaron will bear the sin of the kodashim. So one is to actually gain acceptance for the korban. Another is kind of more basic, which is, shouldn't be usher to give this korban in the first place if there's tumah here? Well, the tzitz allows you to do that. It says, Ushnei hadinim hutzrichu, and you actually need both of these layers. The fact that Aaron is carrying the sin of the kodashim, right? And what the tzitz allows it to be is that there's no sin to do it. That doesn't mean that the korban is kosher. It just means you didn't do an avera, right? Dilivan avera, because besides for the question of whether you transgressed, who din de avodat tum'ah ben betumat korban ben betumat makriv hi muchulalet. Because you would say, even if you didn't do a sin, a korban that was given in tum'ah shouldn't be sacred. It shouldn't count. And therefore, you need the tzitz that's going to gain acceptance for this korban as well, right? So there's two layers. One is it sinful for you to do this in the first place once there's tum'ah involved? And then the second is it accepted as a korban so that you don't have to give another korban? Unisiat havon gamkin hutzrach, right? And you also need the lower layer of making sure that this is mutar to do. Because b'makom sheyesh avera, if you don't have that lower layer, and therefore you say there's a transgression here that you gave it, how could the korban be accepted? Uvegeder mitzvah babi avera, it would be considered a mitzvah that is the result of doing a transgression, which is invalid, like a stolen lulav. V'lachein shnei hagdarim hutzrichu. Therefore, you needed both of the definitions. Now he's going to return to the Rambam and try to explain the Rambam. Ve'achshav mivu'ar, and now it's understood. Dema de'amar be'gemara, avon hakodashim v'lo avon hamakdishim. The explanation in the Gemara of it has to be about the tum'ah of the object, of the kodshim, and not the tum'ah of the guf, right? Zehu bedin nisiyat ha'avon. That's when it comes to the layer of the tzitz that is trying to say it's not asur to give as a korban, right? Ela dimemela im nishar avon al korcha hakorban lo hurtza, right? If there's still a sin, you can't gain ritzui. Aval kol zeh hu betum'at korban yachid de'ika avon. She says, so when it comes to a korban yachid, an individual's korban, that's where we say, sorry, avon hakodashim v'lo avon hamakdishim. Only if the korban meat, dam, flour got tameh, then we say you're allowed to keep giving it. But if the person did, doesn't work. Aval betumat korban tzibur, but what about the situation of tumah hutra b'tzibur? De avon leka, there is no sin at that lower level. De tumah dechuya b'tzibur, because tumah is overridden for a korban tzibur, right? And again, we're talking about when most people are tameh, or most of the kohanim are tameh. Ukimo heter de kilayim, it's like allowing wool and linen mixtures bivigdei kahuna in the clothing of the kohen. Oh, de kilayim b'tzitzis, or if you have tchelet in your tzitzit, right? It doesn't need the tzitz, right? Hachinami din tuma dechuya b'tzibur gam kein lo tzarich l'ritzoy tzitz, right? It's not needed. Umasha hutzrach letzitz bekorban tzibur. What is the tzitz needed for the korban tzibur? Not to make it mutter to give. It's already mutter to give. Hurak leratzot al hechsher korban shelo yeh mechulal b'shvil shehu b'tumah. What tzitz does is it then allows it to be accepted. Uvedin ritzui korban shatzitz meratzeh. And if you're talking about a korban where all you need is for the tzitz to make it okay, not to give, but to be accepted, because to give it's already fine, then like a chiluk ben hakodashim uvein hamakdishim. I don't care whether the tumah came on the kodshim themselves or on the makdishim, the ones who give, right? So really, really interesting. Dibikra, because in the pasuk, diliratzon lahem lo ktiv hakodashim. The word kodshim that points to the object itself is not in the part of the pasuk that talks about ritzui. Now, let's end by going back up to the psukim to understand what the Elana is saying. The psukim describe Shemot Perek Kavchet. V'asita tzitz zahav tahor. Make this beautiful tzitz, right? Tzitz is like a blossom. Tzitz is like something that can be seen, like mitzitz min hacharakim. Tzitz is like maybe the locks of hair that are near it, right? Make the tzitz. Ufitachta alav pituchei chotam kodesh l'Hashem, and engrave on it the words kodesh l'Hashem. It's holy to God. V'samta oto al ptil tchilet, and put it on a cord of blue. Vayala mitznefet, it's going to be on the headdress. El mul pnei mitznefet yeh, it's going to be in the front of the headdress. Beautiful. And pasuk lamed chet says, Vaya al metzach Aharon, it will be on Aaron's forehead. And here we go. V'nasa Aharon et avon hakodashim, and Aaron will carry the sin of the kodshim, of the consecrated items, right? Asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael l'chol matnot kodshehem, that the Jewish people will give, will sanctify. The point is here, Elana Ezel says, this is the track of the tzitz that actually allows you to bring a korban b'tumah. And that's only for the kodshim, meaning it's only if the korban itself is tameh. It's not for the makdishim. It's not if the people It's not if the person, it's not if the owner, it's not if the kohen, right? And then the end of the pasuk is Vaya al mitzchot tamid. It will always be on the forehead of the kohen gadol. Liratzon lahem lifnei Hashem, to gain acceptance for them before God. And says the Evana Esel, the part that talks about gaining acceptance doesn't talk about whether it's about the Kodshim or the Makdishim. It could be for both. And therefore, you can take something like tum'ah hutra b'tzibur, or by the way, tumat tehom, where there is no avon, there is no sin of giving those b'tumah, because tumah hutra b'tzibur, and because tumat tehom has its own logic. But they still need ritzui. They still need to be accepted as korbanot. And then the tzitz is going to do. When it comes to the tumah of the food itself, I don't mean the food, I mean the korban itself. Actually, be careful not to say the food because the food is a problem, right? The korban itself, the tzitz is going to do everything. It's going to allow you, even if this meat or blood or flour is tameh, it's going to allow you to give it, and then it's going to gain ritzui on it, right? So two tracks in the tzitz. Now, where does this leave us in terms of big picture? First is, I have to be honest, I don't understand the tzitz, right? I don't understand the tzitz. I think it's majestic and beautiful and incredible, but I don't understand it exactly. I'm much more drawn to Tosfot because it's cleaner to just say this is about when animals become tameh, and the tzitz is part of the mikdash, and the animals are given on the mizbeach, which is part of the mikdash. I don't want to think the tzitz is not talking about people at all, right? It's just easier to think that way for me. But what the Rambam, or at least the Ibn Ezel, is trying to suggest is, well, wait a second, think about the tzitz. You can't just erase the fact that there might be something wrong in giving the item, right? Meaning you have to consider the possibility of avera before you get to the level of accepting something as valid for what you're giving it for, accepting it as a korban. And I do think that's interesting to consider, that the tzitz is basically there for anything that can get to that point of ritzui, right? There are plenty of things that can't, right? A person just walking into the mikdash when they're tummy, a person eating consecrated foods when they're tummy. None of that. All you can do there is atonement. All you can do there is kapara. But here we're now dealing with something, we're dealing with something else. And what we still have, our outlier is still in all of this. And I think that's really important to remember. Our outlier in all of this is there is no ritzui, there is no recourse for somebody who gives a korban yachid when they are tameh, when the kohen is tameh, period. There is no such recourse. So it's important for us to look at the whole system of korbanot and tum'ah and say, we've got something for people who walk into the mikdash, right? And this is all shogeg, or eat korban meat when they're tameh. We've got something for when the meat itself or the blood or the flour becomes tameh of the korban. We've got something when you have most of the people are tmeim, or most of the kohanim are tmeim, and you have to give a korban tzibur. We've got something when there's a source of tumah, I should say here, even in a korban yachid, there's a source of tumah that nobody should ever know about. What we do not have a track for, what cannot be solved for, is a yachid who gets tameh with tumah yedua, or the kohen gets tameh with tumah yedua, and that korban is given. That korban is invalid. They shouldn't be giving it. And the only time we'd even talk about it is after the fact. So I hope this just kind of evens out or fills out your general perspective on this. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to next time, as ever.